Salve citizens, it's good to have you back again. In our last session, we covered the Punic Wars, and we saw how Rome's wars against their great rival of Carthage resulted in a massive expansion of Roman territory and their first big steps towards becoming the great empire that we know they're going to be. In today's session, we're going to see how the growth of empire creates a number of, shall we say, growing pains on an economic, political, and social level that will nearly bring the Republic to its knees. So on to the essential questions. Well, the first thing we want to look at is, with the growing territory that Rome now has on its hands, how are they going to govern all of that land? Because Rome was originally designed to be a republic, not an empire. So how do they organize and govern this vast and ever-growing territory? Then we'll look at the growing pains. We'll see how Rome's territorial growth is going to translate into massive political, economic, and social problems. We'll also examine the Roman government's response to each of these problems and what the results were for these responses. And I'll just kind of tell you straight out, the results are not particularly good. But we'll look at all that as we move forward here in today's session. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. So by the end of the Second Punic War in 202 BC, Rome's growing territory consists of all the Italian peninsula, all of the islands of the western Mediterranean Sea, and the coastline all the way up to Spain. Very sizable. The end of the Second Punic War pretty much doubled Rome in size. Well, less than a century later, by 133 BC, wars in Spain, wars again in North Africa, wars in Greece, Illyria, and Asia Minor have now doubled Rome in size again. You can see on the map all the territory that is now controlled by Rome. Even the cradle of Western civilization, Greece, is now subject to Roman control. Rome is now the master of nearly the entire Mediterranean Sea region, and they've done that in less than a century after the Punic Wars. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the government of the Roman Republic was designed to meet the needs of a city-state, not an empire. And so as a result, maintaining such a vast territory is going to be incredibly problematic. The Senate by itself cannot rule these far-flung reaches of these new territories. So to address the problem, what the Senate does is they divide all of Rome's non-Italian territories up into provinces. Each of these provinces would then pay taxes to Rome. Now, the Senate itself would directly rule the Italian peninsula. But all of the other territories, all of the other provinces, as they were called, would be ruled by Senate-appointed officials called proconsuls. The proconsuls were governors. They're basically like little mini dictators that ruled over their province. Additionally, the Senate would appoint officials called publicans to collect the taxes in the provinces. So to govern this growing empire, the Romans created provinces, and they put governors and tax collectors in place appointed by the Senate to rule over those provinces. This is actually the exact same model that the Persians used years earlier to govern their growing empires. And we had talked earlier about Rome and Persia being somewhat related. We can kind of see that relationship here in the way that Rome sort of hacks up and governs its new empire. Now, as I mentioned, the proconsuls and publicans, they ruled the provinces with near dictatorial power, which is kind of a big deal. And as long as you have someone good and upright and honest and willing to work in these positions, then you should be okay. But in many cases, these exceptional levels of power led to a number of these officials becoming incredibly corrupt. As they say, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And these guys had near absolute power in their provinces. They would do things like accepting bribes or bribing people, extorting people. They'd steal money from the local provincial treasuries or just simply mistreat the people that they were tasked with ruling over. And as you might imagine, the people who lived in the provinces weren't too keen on it. If they complained to the Senate, nothing was ever done because many of these guys were appointed by the Senate and had friends in the Senate. And so thus the people living in the provinces ultimately found themselves rebelling against Roman control. Well, the rebellions forces the Senate to have to send legions into the provinces and station them there on a permanent basis. Well, as we know here in America, war is really, really expensive. And so this policy of keeping legions stationed in all the far-flung provinces of the empire cost Rome a great deal of money. And as such, the Senate is now in very great need of a new source of revenue. And they will find that source of revenue in land. Basically, the Roman government gets into the real estate business. See, in order to raise the needed revenue, what Rome begins to do is sell and rent a lot of the new property that it had gained through conquest. I mean, they had a lot of land that they had gained, which means they had a lot of real estate to work with and a lot of revenue to gain from this. And of course, who's going to be able to afford this stuff? Well, it's going to be wealthy individuals, patricians, like, say, the proconsuls and the publicans in the provinces, who really caused a lot of these problems to begin with. Well, they had the money, so they would rent or buy up the land. And on that land, they would set up these large farming estates that the Romans called latifundia. Latifundia is kind of like the Roman version of a plantation, if you will. They might grow crops, they might herd animals, it might be mining, it might be lumber, but it'd be a huge estate, sort of like a plantation, in which you would produce some kind of crop or product. Now, due to the large number of Roman conquests and war, there happens to be a large amount of slaves available. Outside of Italy, the Romans would indeed enslave populations that tended to rebel against them. So this means that slave labor is readily available, which means the latifundia owners are using slave labor to work the crops and other products on their latifundias. Now, because slaves are cheaper than paid laborers, all you do is buy them and make them work, you don't pay them a wage. Because they're cheaper, the latifundia owners could turn around and sell their crops and sell their products at a lower price than the small farmers in Italy could do. Well, being able to undersell the small farmers put many of those small farmers out of business. And so with the proconsuls and the publicans and these wealthy patricians making more and more and more money, they would now begin to buy up and buy out the out-of-business small farmers in and around Rome and in the Italian peninsula. They would combine all these farms, then make new latifundias in and around Rome and in Italy itself. Well, even more latifundias puts even more small farmers out of business. And so now you've got all these poor farmers who are put out of work by the economic situation, and they need to find jobs somewhere else. Well, the best place to look to find a job is where the businesses and the people are, and that's in the cities. And so all of these out-of-work farmers began streaming into the cities of Rome, other parts of the Italian peninsula, and other parts of the empire, trying to find jobs. But unfortunately, when they get to the cities, they can't find any work, because guess who's taken all the jobs in the cities too? The slaves. Owners of businesses in the cities recognize that slave labor is cheaper and it makes them more money, so they replace much of their paid labor with slave labor. So there aren't even many jobs to be found in the cities of Rome either. And so now Rome and other cities in its territory are being inundated by this growing class of urban poor. Thousands upon thousands of unemployed, homeless, and hungry people are filling the streets of Rome and other cities, creating a huge risk of crime, social disorder, and outright rebellion. So the Roman government kind of needs to address this issue. It's kind of a big deal, but their solution is really kind of lackluster. The Roman government's solution to this problem isn't to solve the problem, but instead to cover it up with a Band-Aid. The Roman government's solution is simply to keep the masses of the poor and unemployed placated, keep them happy by providing them with different forms of government benefits. The urban poor were provided with free or cheap food, often bread and other staple products, and they were also provided with free entertainment. They got free admission to chariot races, gladiator fights, plays, and other forms of entertainment. The idea was keep a little food in their bellies so they're not thinking about being hungry, and otherwise keep them entertained and distracted so they don't think about wanting to rebel or cause trouble. And does it keep the peace for the time being? Yes. But does it solve any problems? No, it sure doesn't. As a matter of fact, Roman politicians began to use this to their advantage, constantly promising more food and more amusements to the masses in order to win votes and get elected. And so the poor continually vote for anybody who promises to give them more cheaper free food and more free amusements. And thus, the poor remain poor. Because after you've eaten your free bread, you still don't have a job and way to get more food. After you've finished watching a chariot race and a gladiator fight, yes, that was exciting, but you're still homeless and hungry and unemployed. And so rather than the social and economic problems being fixed, the problems in Rome continue to get worse and worse and worse. All right, so what did we see today? Well, we saw Rome continue to expand their borders into an ever growing, an ever more expansive empire. We also saw how they organized and governed this growing empire. But we learned additionally that Rome's growth is bringing a number of problems. Political, economic, and social problems will be the result of Rome's growth and the mishandling of that growth by the Roman government. We looked at the Roman government's response to each of these problems, and we saw that the results were a bit less than stellar. So these are the essential questions. Be ready to discuss them the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.